Good afternoon. I'm Dwight Fielder, BLM's Chief of the Division of Fish and Wildlife Conservation. Welcome to our webinar on Greater Sage-Grouse Conservation. I apologize for the delay today. We're having some technical difficulties, and it's looking like Forest Service folks may not be able to join us today because of a video streaming issue. I would remind folks that this video will be available at a later date so that everyone will be able to watch it. I'm glad you're able to join us this afternoon, those of you who are able to join us this afternoon. And we hope this session helps to clarify what we're doing, how we're doing it, and to answer any questions you may have about our Greater Sage-Grouse Conservation Planning effort. We'll begin today's webinar with a message from Department of the Interior Secretary Ken Salazar, who has been heavily involved in promoting the process and our interagency approach.
Hello, I'm Ken Salazar. It's an honor for me to be the Secretary of Interior and to be able to work with your governors and with all your fish and wildlife agencies, with the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, in addressing the issue of the sage-grouse in the West. We know the 11 states where we have sage-grouse habitat, and we also know that the way that we're going to resolve the challenges that we face is working together, the states and the United States of America and the federal agencies that we oversee. For us in the West, we know that jobs are critically important on the vast public lands which we manage on behalf of the American public. We know the jobs that are created from oil and gas and renewable energy development and tourism on those lands. We also know the importance of conservation and the protection of important species for us to be able to continue the hunting and fishing and wildlife heritage traditions of the West. I believe, as Secretary of Interior, that we can accomplish both as we move forward with dealing with the sage-grouse and its habitat, that we can protect the sage-grouse and its habitat by making sure that we're identifying those sweet spots that need to be protected for its habitat, and at the same time making sure that as development takes place, that it takes place with the best kinds of practices that we can develop, so that as we develop oil and gas and renewable energy projects and other kind of development, that what we are doing is doing it in a way that is mindful of the sage-grouse and its habitat. I believe we can come to a win-win solution here, and that we can avert the listing of the sage-grouse under the Endangered Species Act. And that is why our great Fish and Wildlife Service directorship, working along with the great leaders of the Bureau of Land Management and all the wildlife agencies of the West and the governors of the West, have been working to develop a sage-grouse strategy that will in fact work. And I'm proud that the United States Forest Service has joined us in that effort. And together, working not only among the public land agencies, but also with private landowners, I believe that we can get this done. I'm very confident that we can and will get it done. And the alternative is not a good alternative. Having a species listed and having sage-grouse habitat essentially driving much of what happens in the West could create significant problems and significant conflicts. I believe that we can put together a collaboration here, as has already been done in the state of Wyoming and is emerging in other states, where in fact we can succeed, and we can have jobs and we can have regulatory certainty with respect to job creation and the usage of these lands in the West. At the same time, we can make sure that we're protecting the sage-grouse and protecting its habitat. Thank you very much for your great help and your participation in this effort.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. We're now going to hear from Ken Mayer, the Director of the Nevada Department of Wildlife, who will discuss how the states are coordinating with us throughout our sage-grouse conservation planning process.
Greetings from Nevada, and thanks for joining us today's Greater Sage-Grouse webinar. I'm Ken Mayer, the Director of the Nevada Department of Wildlife and the point man for WAFWA's Greater Sage-Grouse conservation effort. I'm responsible for overseeing the integration of all of our efforts on this front at the state level. WAFWA has a proud history of leading greater sage-grouse conservation efforts in the western United States. Our Greater Sage-Grouse Conservation Strategy continues to provide the underpinnings for all of our continued efforts to conserve this bird and the sagebrush habitat it depends on. WAFWA's management strategy specifically calls for developing partnerships to design and implement actions to support robust populations of sage-grouse and the landscapes and habitats upon which they depend. We believe that this coordinated partnership approach is the way to go when it comes to greater sage-grouse conservation. We believe that this approach is paying off as we work towards providing the regulatory certainty the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is looking for. I encourage all of you to continue making the effort to be at the table as the federal land managers in the West look towards how their land use plans affect greater sage-grouse habitat management. Your presence is vital to the future management of sagebrush habitats that are home to many different wildlife species in addition to the sage-grouse. At the WAFA Midwinter meeting, a number of people asked for more information about what the federal land management agencies are doing on the lands they manage with sage-grouse habitat. We hope today's webcast improves your understanding of the many positive efforts currently underway to address the need for regulatory certainty in conserving the greater sage-grouse. You'll have an opportunity to ask questions during this webcast. We'll describe how you do that in just a moment. But I encourage you to take this opportunity to clarify any uncertainties you may have. You know, Aldo Leopold once said that conservation is a state of harmony between men and the land. That's exactly what we're striving for. So I encourage all of you, state, federal agencies alike, to embrace what we're trying to accomplish here. In my mind, we're making history. What we accomplish may very well change the way we approach conservation in this nation. So let's embrace this opportunity. Thanks.
Thank you, Director Mayer. As Secretary Salazar discussed in his remarks, we're very pleased that the U.S. Forest Service has joined the BLM in this effort. We'll hear now from Tom Tidwell, Chief of the U.S. Forest Service, who will discuss how the Forest Service is partnering with us in this effort.
Good afternoon. I'm Tom Tidwell, Chief of the U.S. Forest Service. As stewards of the national forest and grasslands, we hold a sacred trust from the American people. Part of that trust is to protect our national heritage. More than for many other countries, our national identity is wrapped up with our outdoor heritage, and a good part of that heritage is our native wildlife. The greater sage-grouse is part of our national heritage, and the sage-grouse is in trouble. We have a unique opportunity to take a collaborative approach with the BLM and the western states to restore and maintain habitat for sage-grouse. If we don't take this opportunity to do what we can for sage-grouse, then the species may continue towards listing, and then we will all lose out. Sage-grouse habitat crosses borders and boundaries, both public and private lands. And with the U.S. Forest Service, we manage about 8% of America's greater sage-grouse habitat. So it's going to take all of us to work together to meet this challenge. Working collaboratively is where we excel. And I am confident by working together with our state and federal partners that we will develop solutions that can only be generated through collaboration. It's important that we tailor our land and resource management plans to protect the greater sage-grouse habitat. However, the BLM and the Forest Service, we work under different laws. So we have different planning processes. We're going to have to work together to coordinate these planning processes. Now, we've dedicated some of our best employees in both agencies to work through the differences so that our efforts mesh as seamlessly as possible. We'll spend a few minutes in today's webinar outlining the specifics of how we will be working together. Our mutual goal is to sustain and restore habitat for the greater sage-grouse. If we keep this goal in mind, I believe our efforts will pay off in a big, big way. Not just for greater sage-grouse, but for all of the wildlife species that rely on sagebrush habitat for their survival. For the sake of our national heritage, for the benefit of all Americans, both now and for generations to come, I want to thank you for your dedication and commitment to take on this important opportunity.
Thank you, Chief Tidwell. Now we'll hear from the Director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Dan Ashe, who will emphasize the unprecedented nature of their commitment to coordinate with their partners in this process.
Good afternoon. I'm Dan Ashe, Director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The Fish and Wildlife Service found that listing of the greater sage-grouse was warranted back in 2010, The only reason we didn't move forward then to immediately list it is the backlog of species that needed more immediate attention than the sage-grouse. The Fish and Wildlife Service has a court-ordered deadline of issuing a proposed rule to list the greater sage-grouse by September of 2015. At that time, we have to issue a proposed rule or change our determination that a listing is warranted. Listing species is not the goal of the Endangered Species Act. Our goal is to keep them from having to be listed in the first place, and if they are listed, to recover them to the point where they can be removed from the list. We'd rather keep sage-grouse populations healthy and viable without going to the emergency room of the Endangered Species Act. Typically, the Fish and Wildlife Service doesn't dedicate a great deal of resources to work on candidate species. As you'll hear from the other federal agency directors in today's presentation, conserving the greater sage-grouse requires all of us to take unprecedented steps. That includes the Fish and Wildlife Service. Director Abbe says that this is not business as usual for the BLM. Well, let me assure you, it's not business as usual for the Fish and Wildlife Service either. We're committed to doing our part to move this process forward. I'm directing our staff to work closely with you every step of the planning process so we can achieve the conservation success we're all looking for. The Fish and Wildlife Service is excited to see our sister federal agencies and the states come together to work jointly to reach the goal of healthy greater sage-grouse populations. We think this is a major step forward.
Thank you, Director Ashe. We'll now conclude the leadership message portion of the webinar with the Director of the BLM, Bob Abbe, who will emphasize our commitment to continued cooperation with our partners throughout our sage-grouse planning effort.
We're here today to provide you with more information about our planning process for federal lands that provide habitat for the greater sage-grouse. Our greater sage-grouse planning effort, which would shore up regulatory mechanisms on BLM and Forest Service lands, is anything but business as usual for us. We're committed to completing this effort in an unprecedented time frame for planning efforts by September of 2014. Meeting this schedule means we must all roll up our sleeves, do the hard work, and make the tough decisions it's going to take to successfully conserve this bird. I want to thank our partners and our sister federal agencies and the states for taking such an active role in the scoping meetings and information briefings on sage-grouse that we've hosted across the West over the past few months. The citizens who are attending these meetings can see quite clearly that we are all in this together and that we're working in tandem to create the most effective response we can to conserve sage-grouse and their habitat while allowing for appropriate uses under our multiple use mission. That's a powerful message to send. I also want to express my appreciation for the state's leadership in developing greater sage-grouse habitat maps that have assisted us with scoping for BLM's efforts. In all of my conversations with BLM employees about this issue, I've been emphasizing the need for them to sit down with their colleagues in the states and with our federal partners to craft the best conservation solutions we can at the level where they need to be implemented. I'm looking forward to today's webinar with you. Working together, I am confident we will be successful.
We very much appreciate the participation of the leadership involved in this effort. In Director Mayer's remarks, he said that we'll give you instructions on submitting questions. You can do that directly through the webinar that you're watching us on right now. If you look on the right side of your computer screen, there should be a box where you can submit your questions. Simply type your question in the box and hit save. Now we'll introduce the Agency Sage-Grouse coordinators who will be answering your questions today. Jessica?
Good afternoon. I'm Jessica Rebedu, the Bureau of Land Management's National Sage-Grouse Coordinator. I'm based out of the headquarters office in Washington, D.C. I'm charged with overseeing BLM's overall sage-grouse conservation efforts. Organizationally, I work close with the two regional management teams, the Great Basin team, headed by BLM's Nevada State Director, Amy Luters, and Project Manager, Lauren Mermejo, as well as the Rocky Mountain team, headed by BLM Wyoming State Director Don Simpson and project manager Johanna Munson. As you know, we've been managing the greater sage-grouse as a BLM-sensitive species for many years. Conserving sage-grouse habitat has, however, been addressed in many different ways in our land use plans that we have developed over time. Consistency and certainty within and among our land use plans were key concerns for the Fish and Wildlife Service, and its warranted but precluded finding on the greater sage-grouse in 2010. As a quick overview, BLM is working to amend as many as 98 of its resource management plans to help provide the regulatory certainty the Fish and Wildlife Service is looking for. We have just completed our joint scoping effort with the Forest Service for this step of the process. We held nearly 40 scoping sessions throughout the species range. Those meetings and the associated public comment period resulted in more than 15,000 comments, which we are working on addressing. Before this planning process, BLM issued 2 key instruction memorandum that are helping to guide our efforts on this front. One addressed the interim management of our lands with greater sage-grouse and the other addressed the incorporation of our National Technical Team report on the science behind greater sage-grouse conservation into our land use planning effort. I'll be answering questions on the instruction memorandums and what the BLM is doing to implement them on today's webinar. I'll also be answering questions about what happened during the scoping process we just completed and the other steps we're taking to help us reach our goal of updating as many as 98 land management plans by September of 2014. The greater sage-grouse process has been fostering substantial interest, so we may not get to all of your questions today. In the event that is the case, we encourage you to reach out to me, Pat Dybert of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, or Glenn Stein of the Forest Service, who are with me today via conference line. Our contact information is Now, Pat and Glenn will introduce themselves and describe their role on the broadcast. Pat? Hi, Pat. Are you going to introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks, Jessica. This is Pat Dybert. I'm with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I'm the Service's National Sage-Grouse Conservation Coordinator based out of the Wyoming Ecological Services Field Office in Cheyenne, Wyoming. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you folks today about this very exciting opportunity to do something positive for sage-grouse. I've been working with the greater sage-grouse since I started graduate research at the University of Wyoming way too many years ago. Previously, I've worked with 2 state wildlife agencies before I came to the service 14 years ago. And I was with the service for less than 1 year before I began working on this species. I was also one of the co-authors of the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agency's Greater Sage-Grouse Conservation Strategy, and more recently was the primary author on 2 listing determinations for the greater sage-grouse. Both are not warranted determination, and we concluded in 2005. And our more recent March 2010 warranted but precluded determination on the greater sage-grouse. I'll be focusing my energy today on answering questions regarding the threats raised in our March 2010 finding during today's webinar. So if you have any questions regarding those threats, I'd be pleased to answer those. But I also like to emphasize the fact that the service is fully committed to working with the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service, as well as our state partners, in addressing concerns for the species, primarily through the regulatory mechanisms when BLM and Forest Service revises their land use plans. We do have wildlife biologists in every single state across the species range who will be specifically charged for working with these cooperating agencies to make sure that we get the proper regulatory mechanisms in place so that when we have to make a final listing determination for the species, it can be one that is positive both for the species and for management of our public land. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have, but for now, I'll turn it over to Glenn.
Thanks, Pat. I'm Glenn Stein. I'm the Forest Service's Sage-Grouse Project Manager. I work out of our Washington, D.C. office, but I'm currently stationed in Ogden, Utah. The Forest Service is looking at amending as many as 20 of our land management plans, covering about 11 National Forest System units, and about 20 individual planning unit areas. Over my career, I've done a lot of work with the Fish and Wildlife Service. Some of that has been aimed at taking a proactive conservation approach for several at-risk species that are found on National Forest System lands. I'm very proud, for example, of the work we did a few years ago for the Canada lynx, where the Forest Service was the lead agency and the BLM was a joint partner. I think our work on the Canada lynx has been a great success story. My work on the greater sage-grouse encompasses all of the National Forest System lands within the range of the greater sage-grouse. And right now I'm charged with addressing greater sage-grouse conservation on a range-wide basis. I'm coordinating closely with Jessica and her colleagues on the Great Basin and Rocky Mountain teams. And today on this webinar I'll be covering questions on how the Forest Service is linking our distinct planning processes with the BLM's processes throughout this effort. So I'll be available or willing to help answer any of those questions relating to the Forest Service specifics. And now I guess we'll start with questions. So Dwight, back to you for the first question.
Okay, looks like this first question probably would go to Jessica. There's a lot of concern about your National Technical Team report and how the agencies are using it to update its land use plans. Could you please clarify how you're using this report for us?
Sure. So the National Technical Team report was intended to convey the best available science that a group of interagency folks as well as state agency and sage-grouse scientists put together. So we put together the report so that we would analyze the best available science in our land use plans. So it's not intended to be a one-size-fits-all, as I think some folks have heard, or a singular solution to what should be addressed in your land use plans. It's intended to convey the best available science, recognizing that that may not be consistent with the needs of sage-grouse at a local level. So we want you to work with your partners and with the Fish and Wildlife Service and everybody who has worked so diligently on sage-grouse over the years to develop a solution that works for your planning area. But please use the technical team report as a resource for best available science. Does Pat or Glenn have anything they want to add?
Yeah, great job.
Okay. Well, second question, I think we'll throw this one your way, Glenn. Says, I'm glad to hear that our leadership recognizes that there are substantive differences between the BLM and Forest Service planning processes, but I'm still not clear on how we're going to be resolving our two very different approaches. Could you clarify for us how we're going to be crosswalking between these two processes?
Sure. The two teams, BLM and the Forest Service, have looked very closely at our two planning regulations, and we've done a lot of discussing and crosswalking on how they are going to fit together, and found we have quite a few similarities. Really, we have a lot of the same language. For example, we both have goals and objectives in our plans, and we have a lot of similar requirements as far as how we go through our planning effort. And so I'm getting more and more comfortable that we're going to be able to do a real good job of meshing our two planning processes and coming out with plan amendments potentially that will work for both agencies pretty smoothly.
Great. Thanks, Glenn. The next one, why don't we give to Pat? It says, how will we know if the land use plan revisions we are working on are going to be acceptable to the Fish and Wildlife Service? Should we be spending all this effort if we're still going to miss the mark?
Thanks, Dwight. Our intent is to start working with the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service at the field office level. So we'll be working with folks step to step, hand in hand, trying to address any concerns or any issues that come up locally. If we do that well, if we're working with each other day to day, the mechanisms that are finally put into place should have been fully vetted through our review process, fully vetted at the field level, and then it comes up through my office. We should be almost certain that any regulatory mechanism that goes into place as all these interactions will, in fact, address our regulatory mechanism concerns.
Great. Oh, we've had a few other questions come in. Why don't we start this one with Jessica? There are a couple questions, Jessica, about how about the Washington State distinct population segment, and I guess, why is it not included in this planning effort?
Sure. So there was a review of whether or not it should be, and folks determined that there's a lot of ongoing efforts specific to that population that are already underway, and that because of its general isolation and those processes, that it made more sense to address them through what was already going on rather than this additional process. So we encourage folks with questions specific to the Washington DPS to work with your Oregon and Washington State Director and Fish and Wildlife Service entities. But Pat might be able to provide a little bit more background, given her involvement with a number of those groups, about the Washington DPS. Do you have anything to add?
Sure. The Washington DPS was made a distinct population segment prior to our range-wide determinations for the greater sage-grouse, and it was based on some subspecies designations. Our Washington field office folks are working closely with the local fishers there to try to get some good things done on the ground for that DPS. However, it will be the service's necessity to resolve the status of that DPS, whether it remains a distinct population segment or is routed to the entire range-wide effort. We make our final determination in 2015. So I see that the work that's going on locally with the state and with the other federal agencies involved there is significantly contributing to our larger conservation goal for the species.
Okay, great. Next question is, can you please list for me which science supports the 3% disturbance limit in the NTT report, and I'm unable to find where the metric is coming from. Thank you. I'll throw that out to anyone, but I do know that you were on the NTT, Pat. Did you want to take a first crack at that 3% threshold?
Sure, definitely will. We do have science that supports that if you get to a disturbance density of greater than one disturbance per section, or one disturbance per 640 acres, we start seeing negative population responses for the greater sage-grouse. Additional work that has come out on that has suggested that at least a 5% disturbance has a negative impact on the greater sage-grouse. The 3% disturbance was set up by the National Technical Team. The biologists on that team with our best professional opinion, because there's also anecdotal information that shows us that you get to a 1% disturbance and you start seeing individual response to disturbances on the landscape, individual response to the greater sage-grouse, either failure to reproduce or failure to survive from one seasonal habitat to another. So while you won't find anything in the literature that specifically defines 3%, it is based on best professional opinion. It is based on literature regarding the disturbance threshold for greater sage-grouse that we do have. This comes from the oil and gas literature, or the studies on oil and gas impacts on sage-grouse. 3% was set up as a target, as a guideline to try to achieve, so we have the minimal footprint, trying to stop that footprint before we start actually seeing population level effects on the greater sage-grouse.
Great. Any follow-up?
No, I think Pat covered it well.
Okay, great. Thank you, Pat. Oh, there's a question here that says, how will we be expected to incorporate the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service? It says CET report. I think maybe they're referring to the COT team report due out this July. Does that sound right, Pat?
It does. The COT team report, the COT team is the Conservation Objective Team, where we are working with our state partners and with USGS to try to identify what a healthy and viable sage-grouse population looks like on the landscape, not just relative to our listing decision, but relative to long-term conservation for the species. That is, what do we have to have out there on the landscape to keep sage-grouse around in perpetuity? That report is currently scheduled to be released for peer review at the end of May. And that report will help, I think, inform some of the land management decisions that are made under the new structure. Where I think it fits in best with both the BLM and the Forest Service planning process is many of the habitat concerns we have relative to sage-grouse can be resolved with proper regulatory planning. And I think our COT report will help inform what kind of regulatory mechanisms need to be incorporated into the Forest Service and BLM reports so that we can achieve this long-term conservation objective of maintaining sage-grouse in perpetuity on our lands.
Okay. Appreciate it, Pat. There was a question that came in from Forest Service, and it said the site's blocked by USDA. Does this mean we will not be able to participate in this webinar? And as I mentioned toward the beginning of this broadcast, there were some video streaming issues. Unfortunately, we're not able to work them out, but this webinar is being recorded, and it will be available on the BLM website pretty soon after this webinar is complete, probably within a week. Yes, I'm told that within a week. Okay, let's see. Here's one about landscape conservation cooperatives, LCCs. Will there be an expanded role for the LCCs in sage-grouse and sage-steppe habitat management? If so, can you describe that? Jessica, you want to take a crack at that one?
Sure. So there's what we're working towards in the short term and the long-term conservation realities for sage-grouse. And I think while we're working through these planning processes, we're looking toward to LCCs to provide research and support in that regard. But as we're moving forward through the management of sage-grouse, I think folks are envisioning that the LCCs will really serve to help support a number of other processes that we're working with, or BLM's got eco-regional assessments, as well as an assessment, inventory, and monitoring strategy, all of which are coordinating closely with the products of the LCCs. And I think we're all envisioning that the LCCs will be integrated to support the landscape management framework for sage-grouse as we move forward through our land use planning processes and into the future for sage-grouse. Pat Dybert also works pretty closely with LCCs, and maybe Glenn has some things to add, so I'd like to open it up to them as well. Pat, do you have anything?
Sure, you bet. I am working very closely with our LCC science coordinators in the service to bring the LCCs into this process, and we have drafted some internal proposals on how we can engage their efforts into this process. Those proposals are still being vetted internally, so I don't want to go into too much detail here, but we definitely intend on bringing in our LCC partners on this. We think they'll be a valuable asset to helping us kind of focus on where all the moving parts are going and help maintain communication and data sharing between all the entities.
Great, thank you, Pat. There have been a number of folks who have commented that the volume is low, and we're working on trying to get the volume up and moving the mics a little bit closer to the speakers. I appreciate that feedback. One thing that is, let's see, mentioned here, maybe you'd want to take a crack at this, Pat. Why is, and there are a couple that touched on this, why is hunting of the greater sage-grouse still permitted in some states?
That's a great question. Hunting, the greater sage-grouse, while it is a candidate species under the Endangered Species Act, actually all management authority for the species is still retained by the states. Being a candidate gives this bird no special status under the Endangered Species Act. And hunting is an activity that is governed by the states. In our 2010 status review for the species, we determined that hunting was in fact not a factor that was leading to the decline of the greater sage-grouse. And a couple of reasons for that. Number one, there are very few data that show that hunting has a negative impact on sage-grouse populations overall. But secondly, and probably most important, is that the states are very capable of moving in very, very quickly and stopping or modifying hunting seasons should another problem become evident, such as significant habitat loss or perhaps something like West Nile virus hitting these birds in the late summer. And in fact, the state of Wyoming has shut down, emergency closed their seasons for West Nile virus in the past to avoid having any additional impact on the bird. So because the states were so very responsive, had the regulatory tool by which to do this, and the fact that there's very little data that suggests that in a good, healthy habitat, hunting has any negative impact on long-term sustainability of the sage-grouse. We did not acknowledge hunting as a negative listing factor for the greater sage-grouse. Most states have chosen to continue their hunting seasons. They are very abbreviated. They have a very low level of take. 2 states have in fact stopped hunting altogether, and those states are also, the states that still do hunting also still retain the opportunity to do emergency closures if necessary, as we have just recently seen in a part of the state of Wyoming.
Great. Thank you, Pat. This question, I'm going to kick this one to Glenn first and then Jessica. Given that there are hundreds of candidate species, why was the greater sage-grouse selected as a species of emphasis?
Yeah, because it's so range wide and it impacts potentially so many things. It's of great concern to all the 3 federal agencies and the states as well. Has a potential for fairly significant impacts, particularly the possibility of that if it were to get listed. So we've all chosen to address those issues and work to conserve the species on federal lands so that we eliminate the potential for it to get listed and are able to continue to manage for it proactively.
So I would just add, as far as we can tell, this bird just really doesn't like most things that that humans do, and so that includes most of the types of activities that are authorized on public lands. And so, in addition to, it's such a wide-ranging species, and if it were to get listed, the consultation burden for the agencies and for the Fish and Wildlife Service and BLM and Forest Service would be very large and would take up quite a bit of our staff time to negotiate. And it also would set up a potential additional litigation target as part of the biological opinion that would then need to be prepared as a decision point by the Fish and Wildlife Service. So it could really stand to limit our flexibility relative to conserving the bird while continuing to enjoy our public lands throughout the range of the greater sage-grouse, which is 11 western states. So I'd say relative to other candidate species, that wide-ranging component and just the interaction with so many of the things that we all do on public lands and enjoy from public lands to help sustain our economies and aesthetic enjoyment, that we concluded it warranted special consideration.
Great, thanks. There's a question here, will the BLM, and I guess this can include the Forest Service as well, work closely with local sage-grouse working groups to tap into their vast local knowledge of the habitat? You want to start with that one, Jessica?
Sure. So I think that, as we've said throughout this whole process, I think maybe my mic's not picking up well, so I'll sit real close. As we've said through this whole process, is coordinate, that, there's been a lot of people that have worked very diligently on sage-grouse, towards collective outcomes for a number of years. I think WAF was started way back in the 50s. The Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies started way back in the 50s with a sage-grouse conservation type plan. And so Actually, Pat, do you want to add something? Sorry to catch you off guard.
Yeah, could you repeat the question, please? Right, what was the question again? I'm sorry.
Oh, I thought you had it up there in front of you. I'm sorry, guys. I had a little bit of an asthma hiccup, so I passed it over to her.
Well, it was a question about working with the working groups, and are we going to, as we go through this process, tap into the knowledge of the local working groups? And so I'm not... if it's a specific to sort of the planning process, then Glenn and Jessica, that would kind of be in your bailiwick. If we're looking at the overall conservation of the sage-grouse, then obviously that's something you'd probably want to speak to, Pat, since you've been with us for so long.
Sure. So now that I'm not asthma-y any longer, I'll take the rest of it. So anyway, we've got a really complex strategy that we're working with at various levels in the organization with the Fish and Wildlife Service and the state agencies, the Forest Service, and all of our other partners, including those state local working groups. And so I think we're really hoping that through this unprecedented coordinated effort that we'll capture all of these long-term efforts and the thoughts and work that have gone into all of them into our land use planning process, and that will come forward through a comprehensive decision-making structure that we'll end up with and be able to provide to the Fish and Wildlife Service in 2014 to support their eventual decision relative to the listing of sage-grouse. So,
Anything to add there, Pat? Or Glenn?
Yeah, I tell you, we have an amazing wealth of information out there in the landscape through our local working groups, and I think it would really behoove us to tap into those resources from all different aspects and make sure that we have incorporated their understanding and knowledge in the landscape.
Super. Next question's for you, Glenn. It says, has the Forest Service released a sister document to BLM's report on national greater sage-grouse conservation measures? If so, can it be emailed to Fish and Wildlife Service staff? So a report on national greater sage-grouse conservation measures was our NTT report, correct? Yes.
yes.
Glenn?
No, we haven't issued anything. We're using the BLM's NTT report, and we're currently working on some interim direction that will address using the NTT report and any other kinds of interim methods, tools, whatever that we want folks to use while we're working our way through this process. So, there'll be some direction coming out from the Washington office. We're hoping within the next couple of months. But we're pretty pleased with the work that BLM put into that NTT report. Don't believe that we need to do a separate effort. They work using the best science that's available. It's the same science that's available to us. And so we're pretty comfortable with their report.
Okay, great. Next question, we'll start with you, Jessica. It says, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and state fish and game agencies are being asked to review the BLM and Forest Service draft EIS revisions for adequate range of alternatives. Isn't that a NEPA question that is BLM's cross to bear? I guess so. In other words, I interpret the question to mean, why are we asking Fish and Wildlife Service and state fish and game agencies to review our draft EIS revisions for adequate range of alternatives?
Sure. So I think, as I articulated before, we're working with all of our partners in a really unprecedented way, and so that's probably coming across as unsuspected in some instances, or just different than what we've done in the past. But our goal there is to make sure we're getting it right, and so your state agencies have worked extensively with sage-grouse for years through your responsibilities for managing space that aren't under the federal authorities of the Endangered Species Act and other laws. So you have a very intimate knowledge of the bird and a lot of data and information that you can help share with us, as well as the Fish and Wildlife Service and their assessing through the various points that they have whether or not the species warrants listing, and what they're thinking about as they're gearing up to needing to make that decision here in 2015. And so really we're looking at the range of alternatives with you all to make sure we've included a wide enough range and an adequate range that we are getting it right and we are analyzing the right types of information. So yes, the burden of NEPA does fall to the BLM. It is what we are completing through this process, but we're really hoping that you can be there with us and help us along the way to make sure that we all agree that we're headed in the right direction, we're analyzing the right things, so that we can get to the right place at the end of the 2014, end of fiscal year 2014, to be accurate.
Okay. Next question, we'll start with you, Pat. There's sort of an ecological adequacy aspect to this question, as well as sort of a NEPA planning aspect to it. But it goes, what are the chances for the BLM and Forest Service to simply adopt the state sage-grouse plans for applicability within the given state?
I think that depending on the state that you're in, those are definitely things that the BLM and Forest Service ought to consider when developing their land use planning documents. I think, though, some of the obvious difficulty in dealing with that is just the fact that the BLM and Forest Service are multiple use agencies. And some of the things that are identified in our local working group plans and our state plans are very, very good for that level, but when you try to incorporate it into a larger landscape scale planning, it may not be sufficient, may not be adequate to address the regulatory mechanisms at that larger scale. The state of Wyoming, the BLM is adopting the Wyoming State Conservation Plan for the species, and to date that process has gone very well. So there is a precedent set for doing that, but I think it's going to take a lot of careful coordination to make sure that as those state plans are worked into BLM and Forest Service planning processes, that the nuances, the differences in the type of management that industry land management agencies do versus some of the state level information need to be resolved before they'll be effectively incorporated.
So I just like to add that, that BLM is certainly, that's another thing I think that we're looking for feedback relative to our range of alternatives is where folks are heading with, different planning efforts, and we would like to analyze what is being considered through those processes. But at the end of all of this, we need to arrive at decisions that do what needs to be done for sage-grouse. And so we are working through alternatives to analyze what that is. So I are anticipating working closely with the states and with these various groups to look at what everyone's collective thoughts are relative to how to get to that goal at the end of 2014. So we look forward to what the various products already are, what the ones that are underway and where they'll head, and we'll continue to coordinate with you and what those products create through our land use planning process. So please reach out to your individual project managers and have discussions about what it all is that folks are working on developing so we can work through and analyze the outcomes of those groups.
Okay, thanks. Next, we'll go to you, Glenn, and then maybe to Pat and to Jessica. You all may want to weigh in on this one, but it's how does fire management play into the sage-grouse effort?
Well, I'm not sure on the list of threats to sage-grouse where fire falls in. I believe it's probably in the top 3, and Pat can help me out with that, but it is certainly one of the top issues. As fire moves through and burns up sagebrush, it has serious effects on sage-grouse habitat. And so we're looking at what sort of opportunities and options we have for better addressing not only natural fire, but our management use of fire and how we can improve the situation for sagebrush habitat in areas where sage-grouse use it.
And I think Glenn hit it exactly on the head there. It's going to be a coordinated management effort for fire. He's absolutely right. Fire is one of our top threats to the species. And working on fire management, both reacting to wildfire, but also very carefully planning any prescribed fire in sagebrush ecosystems is going to be very essential to us coming to bring sage-grouse to a successful persistence on this landscape.
So I would just add that, as both Pat and Glenn have articulated, that fire is a big concern for sage-grouse, and it's stochastic. So we don't know where it's going to occur or how severe it will be, and so we recognize that it will be difficult to address through our land use management planning processes, but we are talking about it at various levels and coordinating on that very topic. And so we hope that we'll get better answers for you as we work through this process, but also that your local teams and everyone are really focusing on fire in addition to all of the threats for sage-grouse and creating solutions at the appropriate planning level to work with that threat.
Thank you. Pat, this one, actually there were a couple of questions that hit on this one. It has to do with the issue of predators. There were some folks who were expressing that they felt like it was a threat to sage-grouse that maybe was understated or not recognized, and that they're intimating that predator populations are on the rise and could be a cause for sage-grouse decline. I know you all looked at that. Can you tell me what you had to say about predators?
You bet. We look at 5 listing factors under the Endangered Species Act when making a determination on whether or not to list a species, of which one is disease and predation. So we did spend a lot of time looking at the effects of predation on the greater sage-grouse. Sage-grouse are prey. They do not die from old age. They usually die because they have been eaten by something else. So absolutely, predators cause mortality among sage-grouse. We would be denying just basic biology if we denied that fact. The concern rises where we have a change, a shift in predator populations that may disproportionately affect the greater sage-grouse, and those shifts occur where we have problems with habitat fragmentation. And that was, in our opinion, the bigger problem with dealing for the long-term conservation of sage-grouse. There are areas where we're seeing what we call newcomer predators becoming more and more prevalent within the range of the greater sage-grouse, so things like red fox, raccoons, and ravens, where we have these animals moving in, these predators moving in response to the fact that our habitat is becoming increasingly fragmented, and we also have greater levels of disturbances, human-related disturbances on the landscape. So while the habitat is in balance, predation is not an issue for the greater sage-grouse because of the evolutionary process that they have gone through with their natural predators. Where we have taken that out of balance is where we have potential concerns for the greater sage-grouse. The concern, however, is that controlling predators in those situations, while you may get a temporary relief in sage-grouse population numbers, you don't solve the underlying problem. The predators by themselves were not determined to be the listing determination or a listing factor for the greater sage-grouse, but predators with associated habitat fragmentation and habitat loss, in fact, we did identify as a concern in our 2010 findings. We're just taking the approach that if we can resolve the habitat fragmentation and loss concerns, we will probably address 95% of our predator populations or predator concerns out there.
Great. Thank you, Pat. Oh, a couple more questions. One, maybe this is for you, Jessica. It says some of the local meetings relative to the land use plan amendment process, the question has been raised that the process won't allow for a locally specific approach to sage-grouse conservation. Is this your understanding based on the plan's regional approach?
It would allow for a locally regional approach where it makes sense such that you can wrap it all up towards a regional or range-wide approach to sage-grouse. So it's difficult, I think, when there's local concerns per bird and when groups have worked through pretty extensive processes to not have that investment in the outcome. And I think a lot of times that does work for what the bird needs. It's just whether or not we can make it make sense as we wrap it all up into a scientifically substantiated argument. So that's really kind of what we're working for our goal. I think we all recognize at the end of the day this is going to likely have some sort of court challenge and will by law need to be able to reference science and reference a scientifically substantiated rationale as to why we selected what we did to move forward with the management of this bird. And to the extent that that includes local groups and outcomes of groups, we certainly encourage and want to see. But our default needs to remain what we can scientifically defend through how we can scientifically defend, our decisions through our process.
Any comments from you, Pat or Glenn, regarding a local versus regional approach?
Yeah, this is Glenn. I guess from my perspective, the process that we're using right now, it's broken up into several sub-regional efforts, typically by state. I know BLM is doing some efforts related to their resource management plans. The Forest Service is looking at amending our plans with language. This is really though about the species across its range, and so we're looking at generally those kinds of things that will work to improve conservation of the species and its habitat across the range. Now, certainly, once we're completed with this effort by the end of 2014, the management activities that take place will take place at the local level, and I think there's certainly at that point in time opportunities for our individual forests and BLM's individual field offices and so forth to work with their local partners to figure out those things that work best at the local level for the conservation of the species within the framework that we've set up for them with this larger effort.
Any follow-up, Pat?
No, my colleagues have done an excellent job.
Okay, great. I think we have time for one last question. Is that correct? I think so. There have been a number of follow-up questions on fire. Let's see. Essentially, I'll read one of them. It says there are many biologists that are resistant to even minimal prescribed sagebrush burning. This seems counterproductive to everything we've learned about the importance of fire on a landscape level for wildlife habitat. And then another question, fire is a big risk to greater sage-grouse. However, fire is also crucially valuable in diversifying habitats for all species, including greater sage-grouse. Will fire be able to be used as a tool to manage vegetation communities, including some minimal sage burning? What percent maybe? Pat, why don't I kick that one your way, because this is something that's apparently on the minds of a lot of folks out there.
You bet. I'm going to take the second question, or the second interpretation there first. Fire is definitely a valuable tool for habitat management for several wildlife species. And I think whether or not fire should be used to manage those species or manage those habitats really depends on what your objective is. If your objective is to maintain habitat for, say, elk or for mule deer, that's a different story than maintaining habitat for the greater sage-grouse. So in determining whether or not fire is the correct tool to use in the landscape, I think you need to just objectively think about what you hope to accomplish with your habitat treatment. And at the same time, honestly assess what the impacts might be to the greater sage-grouse. There are no restrictions nationally, not from the service, regarding the use of fire for management of wildlife habitat, but we do ask for very careful consideration when you use fire to accurately assess what those impacts may be. I see a lot of prescriptions to improve different types of seasonal habitats for the greater sage-grouse through fire. And I guess the first question I would ask, if this fire is being done specifically for the greater sage-grouse, is that in fact a habitat that is limiting to the species? So I don't think it's precluding the use of fire for habitat management tools. I think it's a different kind of intense assessment. I think we also need to be very cognizant of the fact that the fire cheatgrass cycle is our #1 factor for threats to the species in the Great Basin part of the species range. And where you have an understory of non-native grasses or the potential for that to occur, then the use of fire needs to be incredibly carefully considered when doing it for managing habitat.
Okay, great. Thank you, Pat. I'm sorry, but that pretty much brings us to the end of the broadcast. And I do apologize for our technical glitches and our delays today and our inability to get to all of your questions. But for those of you who submitted questions who had your name attached to it, we will definitely refer those to our panel so that they can provide you with an answer. For those of you who did not identify yourself, if you want to ask your question, you can do that by directing those questions to one of the contacts that should be listed on your screen. So again, we'd like to thank you for joining us for today's broadcast, and good afternoon.